Good morning, scientists. Hopefully you've got your straw rocket lab done. Now, on the straw rocket lab, you had a couple things to do. First of all, make sure that you have the data table completed. That is, you filled in all the different rows there. Now, I know there should be 10 rows where you should have changed 10 different things. Now, you could have changed the length of your rocket, started out with a long rocket and cut it a little bit shorter each time and measured how far it went. If you got at least 8 different things changed where you filled up at least 8 rows, that's fine. If you just have like 2 rows blank at the bottom, that's okay. But as long as you did about that many or more, you're good. Now, let's say you change the length. So you started out maybe at 20 centimeters long. Then you would have launched it 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and measured each of those trials and then average them. That's your one test. Then you do another test. You change something else. Maybe cut it a little bit shorter. Maybe it's now 18 or 16 centimeters. Launch it another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Then that's those 5 trials, average them. That's another test. You have to do at least 8 different tests. Could be you're changing the length of it. Maybe you're changing the size of the fins. Probably changing the length of your rocket is probably the easiest thing to do. So once you do that, then you're done. Except you got to identify your variables. Now there is also a place for you to graph it. If you want to graph it, go right ahead. You don't have to though. That's kind of an optional part. Now for identifying the variables, down at the bottom, I uploaded a sample one yesterday, and I kind of wrote a few numbers on there, kind of showing you what to do. And also for the sample part, I added a few questions at the bottom. Make sure you identify the variables. That is, what's your independent variable, what's your dependent variable, and what are your controlled variables. If you watch the last YouTube video I made, I gave you some clues what those answers are. So check that out. So for the Rocket Lab, that's it. That should be turned in. That needs to be turned in. So if you're in my advanced class, that should be turned in by the end of the day Wednesday. If you're in my general science class, that should be turned in by the end of the day Thursday. So make sure that does get turned in. So after Thursday, I'm not grading any of them. So if you turn it in to me Friday, too bad, you got a 0. This is your last grade for this quarter. So do a good job on it. All right, so the Rocket Lab, that's it. One of the biggest rockets is this one right here. This is the Saturn V rocket that went to the moon. Biggest rocket ever built. Now, in the next few years, they're actually planning on building some rockets that are actually going to give this one a run for its money, where it's going to be just about the same size, if not a little bit bigger, because they plan on sending humans back to the moon for the first time in over 50 years. So now, when they launch this big rocket, the only thing that actually comes back to the Earth is this little capsule right here. So this little capsule right here, that's the only part that comes back. 3 guys fit in there. They went to the moon. 2 of them got to walk around on the moon. And 1 guy had to stay in the command module. So just to kind of show you, this is the size of a person compared to this rocket. So pretty small. So there's like a little tiny, it's even small for a Lego dude. So little tiny person here. So that's size right there compared to this rocket. So pretty small compared to this huge rocket here. So just to show you again, pretty big. I mean, this thing's, almost as tall as I am. This thing like comes up to up to my belt. So when they launch this, most of this is all fuel. There's 5 big rockets on the bottom. That's why they call it the Saturn V. And then, as this would launch, the bottom part, it would separate. So you have the first stage would fall off. This is used up. They don't need it anymore. So it would fall to Earth and burn up. And then you'd have the rest of the rocket. That would be blasting off on its way to the moon. So this part is still full of fuel. Now at this point, this top part here, this little tower, this is an escape launch tower. So in case something was going to go wrong, like the whole rocket, these 3 guys are sitting on a bunch of rocket fuel. If this is going to blow up, this tower here would jettison them and pull them off to safety. And then it'd parachute back to Earth, and then the rest of the rocket would blow up or whatever. The new version that they have is the Orion rocket, which is in this picture behind me. And it doesn't have a big tower on top. It's got these other jets that kind of pull it off and could use to land even. And that's the one that's actually launching this week on Thursday. So you can go outside on maybe at 4:30 on Thursday, look outside, look to the north, you might see that going up. It's taking 2 astronauts from Florida to the International Space Station. First time we've had astronauts launching from the United States since 2011 on which was the last space shuttle mission. So you kids were like little babies back then. So keep in mind, keep an eye out for that. Watch the news. I'm going to try to watch that live tomorrow, and should be pretty exciting. I'm looking forward to that. So anyway, going back to my rocket over here. So this is still launching, and this is how they did it back in 1969, which is the first time they went to the moon. So you had this on the way to the moon here. So now this would eventually lose, the fuel would be used up, and then this stage would break apart. And now this one had 5 little rockets on the bottom. Now we've just got one of those same rockets, just a small one on the bottom that would push them on the way to the moon. But eventually this one would have, this is all fuel in here too. This would be out of fuel. They don't need that anymore. So then the last stage inside here is the lunar lander. So how they're gonna land on the moon is hidden inside here. So this part, let's see if we can do this without everything falling apart. So this part would pop open and they do a little maneuver here. And they actually practiced, the first time before they went to the moon, they actually would go in Earth orbit and they launched a smaller version of this rocket, and all they did is they went up in Earth orbit and practiced this. And then they'd have to do a maneuver where they'd have to turn their rocket around. On the way to the moon, they'd have to turn around, dock with this part, and then extract the lunar lander. Pull this out, and then they don't need this part anymore. They get rid of that. And then the lunar lander, its little legs would unfold, getting ready to land on the moon. And then they'd continue on their way to the moon. So they'd continue on their way there. And then when they'd get on, eventually, 2 guys from the capsule here would climb into the lunar lander. So 2 of these little tiny guys here. Hello. They'd climb into the lunar lander, and then they'd separate once they're in orbit around the moon. Not like that. So they'd separate, and then this would land eventually all the way down on the moon. And on the way, when it would land on the moon, you can see it has 1 rocket down there. So as it would go down, they'd use that to slow down, and then eventually they'd get a nice soft landing on the moon. They'd get out, they'd walk around, they'd explore for a few hours. Later on, some of the later missions, they'd actually spend the whole day there, and then they'd get back on board, and then they'd blast off. And now this bottom part, they don't need anymore because it's all, the fuel's used up. They don't need these landing legs, and that's heavy. And then they just need a little rocket engine because the moon has less gravity. That would, so this is still on the moon. If you went to the moon today, you could actually go and see where this is. So who knows, maybe that'll be a tourist attraction one day. Like, hey, look, there's Neil Armstrong's footprints, and hey, there's the eagle that landed there. That's still there. See, we're the Pioneer Eagles, and the first lunar lander was called the Eagle. That's why they say the Eagle has landed. And so here, this little piece goes back up in orbit around the moon and meets up with the command module and docks there. And then the 2 guys that were in there, they get out, they get back in the command module, and all the moon rocks and everything they collected while they're on the moon, they load that back in the command module and back to Earth. But before they go back to Earth, they don't need this anymore either, so they crash landed this into the surface of the moon. So this also is more junk on the moon. And when they crash landed it, they actually did an experiment. So when they crash landed it, it's sort of like crashing a meteor into the moon, but you know when it's gonna hit. So they had seismographs on the surface of the moon. And when they crashed it in there, they used those seismographs to measure the vibrations of the lunar lander hitting the moon. And they detected they were able to figure out if the moon's solid or if the middle of it's liquid. So they're able to determine what the moon's made out of. Now you still have this little command module. Before they get back to Earth, they don't need this anymore. This is fuel, and this is water, and all the other things the astronauts needed to survive. They don't really need this anymore because now they're on their way back to Earth. This parachutes back to the surface, lands in the ocean. Aircraft carrier picks them up, takes them back, and welcome back to Earth, guys. So that's how the lunar rocket, that's how the Saturn V rocket works there with all the different stages. So this rocket they're putting in orbit, this just goes to the International Space Station, but this rocket and the Orion rocket that they're working on launching in the near future, they're gonna try to go back to the moon again, going to the International Space Station, then going and putting a small space station around orbit in the moon, and then from the moon, setting up some human presence on the moon, and then from the moon, going all the way to Mars. So we need to have some kind of base around the moon in order to get to Mars, sort of like as a jumping off point. So this week, exciting stuff. We got the SpaceX mission to the International Space Station leaving from Florida. And we also got all kinds of other things in the near future of the Orion missions, putting humans possibly all the way to Mars. So who knows, maybe one of you will be working as one of the engineers or astronauts or flight specialists on one of those missions in the future. So we'll talk more about that later in the week. All right, stay curious.